This is an unusual year. There's no question about it. And I was taken back to Frederick Douglass made a speech in Rochester, New York in 1852 or so. What is the 4th of July to the slave? And he talked really very eloquently about, how it really wasn't a holiday for freed African Americans. He faced the contradictions and exhorted at least the listeners in Rochester. If you really want to honor this day, you've got to bring the promise of America to everybody, and to particularly the freed slaves who had built the country and sort of did not enjoy any of the, if you will, the real fruits of that labor. And so, I'm constantly reminded of that, and this year has brought it into stark relief. It seems that not only are African Americans focusing on that, but I'm heartened to see and hear that the country, I think, is really beginning to pay some attention to just how far we have to go to achieve that real promise. It's a heartening development, but at the same time, it's disheartening that it has taken this long a time, and it's taken these kinds of these really brutal episodes of killings and brutality on the part of law enforcement officers for most Americans to begin to see this.
One of the things that always strikes me, I think, is the Constitution can be looked at in a lot of different ways. And in some ways, I think the Declaration of Independence set up the Constitution, yet the paradoxes that are embodied really reflect in many ways the paradoxes of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal as opposed to people, and we know that the equality was not present. The balance between individual liberty and collective security, the balances between states' rights and federal rights, all of those things ultimately create a real learning experience, the experiment in self-government. I wonder how do those paradoxes, how do those inconsistencies, the incongruities of it, nonetheless, give us some aspirational hope? You said that you feel more hopeful, or at least have a sense of hopefulness now.
I think I shouldn't say everyone who looks at it. I guess one has to look at it as a hopeful document, as a hopeful set of aspirations, even though we've fallen far short of it. There have been these periods in history. You rightly cite the post-Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15, sort of the first step in sort of getting rid of the institution of human slavery. Step forward, and then you take a huge step backwards. Voting rights are extended, and then there's Jim Crow, where there is the effort to sort of take back those rights. It's that tug and fro that has been quite frustrating, and you wonder, how genuine the nation really is in thinking about and trying to bring these rights to the forefront. But one has to continue to hope, because there's no point in living if there's no hope. I grew up in the 60s, went to college in the late 60s. I grew up in the South, grew up in Georgia. I can remember, 1962, I guess it was, and the Freedom Riders in Alabama, and Bull Connor, and the hoses and dogs that were sicked on people who were trying to, bring again to the nation's attention just how far short it has fallen. And I think there was a galvanizing of the country at that point, because people saw starkly, just what was happening. And I think this period, this pandemic has, in a kind of perverse way, has focused us, or forced us to focus. We've all been at home. We've all been stuck to the televisions, if you will. And we've all seen these things. We've seen the police brutality played out. We've seen the police with their knees on on George Floyd's neck. We've seen here in rapid succession these brutal encounters. And I think this may be another period where I think there's a real opportunity. And I'm especially hopeful because, first of all, I think this is a much more diverse, if you will, not to say integrated, group of people who are pushing forward. And the young folks, the young people, I think, really have begun to see this in ways that they have not before. And I think they are much less tolerant of our neglect or the country's indifference. And I'm hopeful that that energy is not going to be lost. One has to be hopeful.
I've been struck over the last few days reading some very granular and disturbing and accounts of not only, you know, things that happened 400 years ago, but the history of, and that has led to the economic disparity that has held particularly the descendants of slaves in our country, and the real disparity that exists. Those are not things that are, you know, intellectual. Those are things that affect people every day in the way in which they live. The lost generations of wealth building, I think, is the way that it's been characterized. And, you know, we can, you know, rights are important, but so is living every day. And it occurs to me that thinking about what that means on a day-to-day basis, certainly for our students and our colleagues, whether they be staff or faculty, but the difficulties that inure to folks who have not had those kinds of benefits, and folks like me who have had the privilege to be able to live a very different life. Are very meaningful and becoming much more apparent, as you say, as we're sitting here, you know, and during this pandemic, really learning. And I think that there's a value to continue that sort of learning and sharing so that it becomes much more personal. And again, I think that personal understanding is critical to making progress and to really moving forward.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, particularly on the economic disparities. And it's not been accidental. You know, a lot of people think, well, you know, I worked hard and I achieved, and you guys need to work hard and achieve. But there was so much structural disadvantage built in. Again, I grew up in the military community. Many folks there got their start, their economic, buying a home with the GI Bill. My parents were able to do that, but you know, their parents were not able to take advantage of the federal home loan program when it was instituted. The government underwrote mortgages, but left the administration to local authorities, and therefore it was local white authorities. You could have the money. But they were not going to give you the loan. They were not going to underwrite the mortgage. And therefore, there was a generation of 2 generations at least of African Americans in this country who did not even have the opportunity to build the kind of security and wealth that we take for granted. And people don't understand that. And I think we can take this, I hope we will take this opportunity to educate people more about just the structural inequities that have plagued us. And again, I continue to be hopeful. I continue to be hopeful because there's no alternative to being hopeful. And I hope that this is not a moment that we will lose.
It does feel different, and if hope does spring eternal, maybe this is where we'll see hope spring to action, because action is what's called for to ameliorate some of these actions that have just festered over generations, and to fulfill that aspirational goal of the Declaration of Independence, that all men, all people are created equal and have equal opportunities. Thanks, George. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Pleasure. Happy 4th of July, everybody.